The invasion fleet emerged from hyperspace like a storm of metal and malice, their crystalline hulls reflecting the pale light of Earth's sun. Commander HFY stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominance, watching the blue-green world rotate slowly beneath him. His 4 arms crossed behind his back in the traditional posture of contemplation, while his compound eyes studied the tactical displays. "Pathetic," he muttered in his native tongue, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. No orbital defense platforms, no energy shields. Their most advanced vessels barely qualify as interplanetary craft. His aide, a younger Krillian officer named Telvok, approached with measured steps. The rhythmic clicking of his chitinous legs against the deck announced his presence before he spoke. "Commander, our deep scans have completed. The species calls themselves humans. They appear to be in the early stages of technological development. Their weapons are primarily chemical-based projectiles and primitive energy weapons. No plasma technology, no gravitational manipulation. They don't even possess basic force field technology." HFY's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his kind. The Krillian Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past century alone. Each time they had faced species with at least some understanding of modern warfare. This would be different. This would be a harvest, not a war. "Signal the fleet," HFY commanded, his voice carrying the authority of countless victories. "Begin orbital bombardment of their major population centers. We'll crush their spirit first, then take what we need from the survivors." The first antimatter torpedoes screamed toward Earth's surface, each one capable of leveling a city. They struck New York, London, Tokyo, and Moscow in synchronized detonations that painted mushroom clouds across the blue sky. The shock waves rippled outward, and from orbit, the Krillians watched with satisfaction as the primitive world burned. Within hours, every major military installation had been reduced to radioactive craters. The humans' pathetic attempts at retaliation, crude rockets and chemical explosives, were swatted aside by the fleet's defensive systems like insects against window shields. It was exactly as HFY had predicted, a complete and utter rout. But as the commander prepared to order the landing operations, something unexpected happened. Instead of surrender broadcasts or pleas for mercy, Earth's communication channels fell silent. No desperate negotiations, no offers of submission, just silence. "Strange," Telvok observed, his antennae twitching with uncertainty. Previous conquests always resulted in immediate capitulation attempts after the demonstration bombardments. These humans seem to have simply stopped communicating. HFY waved a dismissive appendage. "Fear has likely paralyzed them. It matters not. Begin deploying ground forces to secure the major resource nodes. The sooner we establish control, the sooner we can begin extraction operations." The first wave of Krillian dropships descended through Earth's atmosphere like falling stars. Each transport carried 50 elite warriors, armed with plasma rifles and protected by personal energy shields. They had conquered worlds defended by species far more advanced than these primitive humans. This would be nothing more than a cleanup operation. The dropships landed in formation outside the ruins of what the humans had called Washington, D.C. The Krillian warriors emerged in perfect tactical order, their movements coordinated with the precision that had made them the most feared military force in the galaxy. Their sensors detected no organized resistance, no military formations waiting to engage them. The humans had simply vanished. Colonel Thraknos, commander of the ground forces, contacted the fleet with growing irritation. "Commander HFY, we've secured the landing zones, but there's something unusual here. Our thermal imaging shows the humans have dispersed into smaller groups. They're not concentrating their forces for a traditional defense." "Irrelevant," came the response from orbit. "They lack the technology to pose any meaningful threat to our forces. proceed with occupation protocols. But as the Krillian patrols began moving into the ruined cities, they discovered something that their advanced sensors and tactical computers had failed to predict. The humans hadn't fled in panic. They had adapted. The first patrol to disappear was Alpha Squad, investigating a series of underground tunnels beneath the former Pentagon. They reported finding extensive bunker systems, then their communications went dead. When the search party arrived, they found only scorch marks and the distinctive residue left by human chemical explosives. Improvised weapons, Thraknos reported with disdain. Crude but effective in confined spaces. We'll adjust our tactics accordingly. But the adjustments didn't help. Beta Squad vanished while investigating a human military base. Gamma Squad's last transmission came from inside a subway system, cut short by what sounded like projectile weapons. But impossibly, the shots seemed to come from extreme range. As the reports accumulated, a disturbing pattern emerged. The humans weren't engaging in traditional warfare. They weren't massing armies or attempting to hold territory. Instead, they had transformed into something the Krillians had never encountered before: ghosts. The break in the pattern came during an investigation of a human facility they had designated Military Installation 12. The complex had been partially destroyed in the orbital bombardment, but intelligence suggested it had contained important strategic resources. Captain Veltar led his squad through the ruins, their plasma rifles ready, their shields humming with energy. "Spread out," Veltar ordered, his voice crackling through the tactical network. "Standard search formation. Watch for—" The shot came from nowhere. One moment, Sergeant Kilthox was advancing toward a collapsed building, and the next, his head simply ceased to exist. No plasma signature, no energy weapon discharge, just a small, almost negligible projectile that had somehow penetrated his personal shielding and ended his life instantly. "Contact! Contact!" Veltar screamed into his communicator, but there was no visible enemy to engage. His squad spun in circles, weapons raised, sensors probing, but the thermal readings showed nothing. The optical scanners detected no movement. The audio pickups registered only the sound of settling debris. Then another shot. Corporal Zekmai dropped, his thorax punctured by another impossible projectile. The wound was small, precise, but devastating. Whatever these humans were using, it was unlike anything in the Krillian tactical database. "Thermal bloom, bearing 270, shouted Private Nextall, pointing toward a distant building. Range approximately 800 meters. 800 meters. Veltar's training told him that was impossible. No chemical weapon could maintain accuracy at such range, and certainly not with enough power to penetrate Krillian armor. Yet, as he raised his plasma rifle to return fire, a third shot ended his confusion permanently. The lone survivor, Private Nextall, managed to transmit a partial report before he too fell to the mysterious precision strikes. Unknown human weapon, extreme range, impossible accuracy, they're not where our sensors say they should be. Aboard the Dominance, Commander Zexhai studied the tactical reports with growing unease. In 6 hours of ground operations, his forces had lost 17 patrols without inflicting a single confirmed casualty on the enemy. The humans were using weapons that shouldn't exist, employing tactics that defied conventional military doctrine, and somehow achieving results that his computers insisted were mathematically impossible. "Analysis," he demanded of his senior tactical officer. "The evidence suggests the humans are employing long-range projectile weapons with unprecedented accuracy," the officer replied, his voice tight with confusion. "Effective range appears to exceed our energy weapon capabilities. They're also demonstrating superior knowledge of local terrain and an unusual talent for concealment." "That's impossible. Our sensors are functioning perfectly, Commander. The humans simply appear to be better at hiding than we are at finding them." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Krillians thought they knew about warfare. They had conquered civilizations that possessed energy weapons, plasma shields, and gravitational manipulators. How could these primitive chemical weapon-using mammals be proving more effective than species with 10 times their technological development? The answer came 3 days later, when Captain Morthek's reconnaissance team finally managed to track one of the human weapons teams to its source. The report that followed would reshape everything the Krillian Empire thought they knew about the species they had dismissed as primitive. The human they found was alone. Not part of a squad, not supported by vehicles or advanced equipment. Just one individual, positioned in the ruins of what appeared to have been a civilian structure. His weapon was indeed chemical-based, a projectile launcher that looked like something from a museum compared to Krillian plasma technology. But the precision with which he used it was unlike anything in their experience. The target neutralized our advanced scout from a range of 1.4 kilometers, Morthek reported, his voice filled with something approaching respect. A single shot, center mass, through a gap in the armor plating that our own engineers hadn't realized was vulnerable. He then repositioned and eliminated our heavy weapons specialist from an entirely different angle before we could triangulate his position. "One human," Zexhai repeated slowly. "One human, Commander. And when we finally cornered him—" Morthek paused, struggling to find words that would adequately convey what his team had witnessed. "He didn't surrender. He didn't flee. He simply smiled. Then he triggered some kind of chemical explosive device that had been concealed in his position. Took 3 of my warriors with him." The commander's compound eyes narrowed as he processed this information. "You're telling me that a single member of this primitive species, using obsolete chemical weapons, managed to eliminate 5 Krillian warriors before dying?" "That's correct, Commander, and based on our analysis of his equipment and position, he had been operating alone for at least 72 hours, living on minimal supplies, with no support structure, no communication with other human forces, and no advanced technology beyond what appears to be a standard infantry weapon modified for extreme accuracy." Zexhai felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest. Uncertainty. The humans weren't behaving according to any established pattern. They weren't following any recognizable military doctrine. They were fighting like something else entirely. "What do you recommend, Captain?" Morthek's response was immediate and definitive. "We need to reconsider our assessment of human capabilities, Commander. These aren't primitive warriors struggling with obsolete technology. They're something we haven't encountered before. Something that might be genuinely dangerous." But even as the captain spoke, neither of them realized that their conversation was being monitored. Deep beneath the ruins of Cheyenne Mountain, in a facility that had survived the orbital bombardment through a combination of over-engineering and sheer luck, a handful of humans had managed to maintain a communication intercept program that had been tapping into Krillian communications since the invasion began. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez listened to the translation with grim satisfaction. She had been right about the aliens' overconfidence. They had expected a conventional military response, prepared for armies and aircraft and organized resistance. They hadn't prepared for what the humans had become, hunters. "How many teams are operational?" she asked the communications technician. 67 confirmed active, Sergeant, probably more, but communication is sporadic. They're all operating under Protocol 7. Protocol 7. The designation made Vasquez smile without humor. It was a contingency plan that had been developed decades earlier, based on the assumption that any interstellar invader would possess overwhelming technological superiority. The only way to fight such an enemy would be to abandon conventional tactics entirely. Instead of armies, they would deploy individuals. Instead of holding territory, they would become invisible. Instead of fighting with honor and according to established rules of war, they would fight to win. They would fight like snipers. And among all the snipers now stalking through the ruins of human civilization, there was one whose reputation had become legend even among legends. A man whose confirmed kills numbered in the hundreds, whose longest shot had been verified at over 3 kilometers, and whose psychological profile suggested he was exactly the kind of individual who would thrive in this new type of warfare. The aliens had made a critical error in their assessment of humanity. They had seen primitive technology and assumed primitive tactics. They had seen chemical weapons and assumed chemical limitations. They had seen a young civilization and assumed it would fight like one. They were about to learn that the most dangerous hunter was not the one with the best technology, but the one who understood how to turn invisibility into a weapon. Sergeant Major David Ghost Morrison had been killing since the invasion began, and he was just getting started. The war was about to become very personal. David Morrison had been dead for 3 days, according to the Krillian computers, and he preferred it that way. The aliens had marked his position, called in orbital strikes, and watched the building collapse into rubble. Their sensors showed no life signs. Their thermal imaging detected no heat signatures, and their algorithmic certainty proclaimed the human-designated Target Priority Alpha as confirmed eliminated. They were wrong about everything except the name. Morrison lay in a drainage pipe 200 meters from his supposed death site, breathing slowly through a rebreather that recycled his air and scrubbed the thermal signature that would betray him to alien scanners. The pipe was barely wider than his shoulders, filled with stagnant water that soaked through his ghillie suit, but it provided perfect concealment and an excellent field of fire across what had once been Constitution Avenue. Through his scope, he watched a Krillian patrol moving with the mechanical precision that seemed to characterize everything about their species. 12 warriors, spread in a standard search formation, their plasma rifles sweeping left and right as they advanced through the ruins of the capital. They were competent, professional, and completely predictable. That predictability was going to get them killed. Morrison had been studying the aliens for weeks now, learning their patterns, understanding their tactics. The Krillians were excellent soldiers by conventional standards, but they fought like machines, following protocols, adhering to doctrine, thinking in straight lines. They couldn't comprehend that their enemy might be lying motionless in a flooded pipe, waiting for the perfect shot with the patience of a spider in its web. The patrol leader, distinguishable by the additional antenna arrays on his armor, raised his hand to signal a halt. Morrison could see the alien's mandibles moving as he spoke into his communication system, probably reporting another fruitless search to his commanders. The motion exposed a gap between his shoulder armor and his helmet, a vulnerability that Morrison had identified in dozens of previous encounters. 700 meters. Moderate wind, left to right. No thermal distortion. The shot would have been challenging for most snipers even under ideal conditions. But Morrison wasn't most snipers. He was the man who had once put a bullet through a target's heart at 2 kilometers in a sandstorm. The soldier who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of making the impossible shot. He exhaled slowly, allowing his heartbeat to steady, his breathing to synchronize with the natural rhythm of his body. The rifle in his hands was nothing special by human standards, a modified M107 that fired 50 caliber rounds. But Morrison had customized every component personally. The barrel was hand-lapped, the trigger tuned to break at exactly 2 pounds of pressure, the scope calibrated to account for bullet drop across distances that most infantry weapons couldn't even reach. Against an enemy that possessed energy weapons and personal force fields, it should have been useless. Against an enemy that wore armor designed to stop plasma bolts and explosive charges, it should have been laughably inadequate. Morrison squeezed the trigger. The bullet traveled for 1.3 seconds before finding its target. The patrol leader's head snapped back as the round punched through the gap in his armor, and his body crumpled to the ground with the sudden finality that characterized all of Morrison's work. The other aliens spun in confusion, their weapons raised, their sensors probing desperately for a target that no longer existed. Morrison was already moving. Before the sound of his shot had finished echoing through the ruins, he was sliding backward through the drainage pipe, using techniques he had learned in urban warfare training 15 years earlier. By the time the aliens began firing plasma bolts at his former position, he was 50 meters away and descending into the storm sewer system that had become his personal highway through the dead city. The underground tunnels had saved humanity's resistance. The Krillians possessed orbital sensors that could detect a mouse from space, but they couldn't see through 20 feet of concrete and steel. The subway systems, maintenance tunnels, and forgotten passages beneath every major city had become an invisible transportation network that allowed human fighters to move without detection. Morrison emerged from a manhole cover 6 blocks away, in the ruins of what had been the Smithsonian Museum. His next target was already selected, a Krillian communication hub that had been established in the former Pentagon. Intelligence suggested that the aliens were using the facility to coordinate their occupation forces, which made it a high-value target. More importantly, it was protected by their best soldiers. The Krillians had learned to fear human snipers, but they still didn't understand them. They increased their patrols, improved their armor, developed new scanning technologies, but they continued to think like conventional soldiers. They assumed that better equipment and more personnel would solve their problem. They were about to discover that some problems couldn't be solved with technology. Morrison spent 2 days infiltrating the Pentagon complex, moving through ventilation systems and maintenance shafts like a ghost haunting its former life. The building had been damaged in the orbital bombardment but remained structurally sound, and the Krillians had chosen it as their headquarters, precisely because its construction made it easy to defend. What they hadn't considered was that the same features that made it defensible also made it predictable. The aliens had positioned their command center in the most secure location, the building's core, surrounded by multiple layers of security. Their communications array was placed on the highest point for maximum signal strength. Their guard rotations followed precise timing that never varied. For a sniper who specialized in impossible shots, it was almost insulting how easy they had made it. Morrison established his position in a partially collapsed section of the building's outer ring, 3 levels above ground. The location provided concealment, multiple escape routes, and a perfect angle on the communications array. More importantly, it was a position that the Krillian security algorithms had classified as impossible to occupy due to structural damage. The aliens really needed better algorithms. He spent 8 hours in position, studying the guard rotations, identifying targets, calculating distances and angles. The communications array was protected by overlapping fields of fire from multiple guard posts, automated defensive systems, and roving patrols. Any conventional attack would fail before it began. Morrison wasn't planning a conventional attack. At 03:47 hours, when the night shift was at its most fatigued and alert levels were at their lowest, Morrison began his work. The first target was a guard whose position controlled one of the automated defense systems. The shot was only 400 meters, almost insultingly easy. But the angle required him to fire through a narrow gap between 2 pieces of debris. The alien fell silently, his body concealed behind his position. Morrison's second target was a patrol leader, whose death would disrupt communication protocols for approximately 90 seconds, long enough for what he planned next. That shot required him to account for wind deflection across a distance of 800 meters through a gap barely wider than the bullet itself. The Krillian dropped without a sound. Morrison's third shot was the one that mattered. The communications array itself, protected by energy shields and armor plating that could stop plasma bolts and explosive charges. But shields designed to stop energy weapons had never been tested against kinetic penetrators traveling at supersonic speeds. and armor plating that could deflect charged particles proved surprisingly vulnerable to dense metal moving in a straight line. The 50 caliber round punched through the shield matrix like it wasn't there, shattered the primary relay assembly, and triggered a cascade failure that shut down Krillian communications across the entire eastern seaboard. Morrison was halfway to his extraction point before the aliens even realized they were under attack. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Orbital bombardment turned the Pentagon into a crater. Plasma strikes reduced every building in a 6-block radius to molten slag, and hunter-killer teams flooded the area with enough firepower to level a small city. They found nothing but empty tunnels and the lingering scent of human defiance. Commander HFY stood in his war room, staring at tactical displays that told a story he didn't want to believe. In 6 weeks of occupation, his forces had suffered over 2,000 casualties without achieving a single strategic objective. The humans had no organized military, no advanced technology, no unified command structure. Yet they were winning. "Report," he demanded of his intelligence officer. "Sir, we've identified the source of our primary losses. Analysis of engagement patterns suggests that approximately 60% of our casualties are attributable to a single human operative. Our xenopsychology team has designated him the Ghost, based on his ability to strike without detection." "One human?" "One human, Commander. Current estimated kill count is 317 confirmed, with probable additional kills that we haven't been able to attribute definitively. Range of operations extends across the entire theater. Method of attack is consistent. Long-range kinetic weapons fired from concealed positions, followed by immediate withdrawal using underground transportation networks." HFY felt his certainty cracking like damaged armor plating. How is this possible? Our sensors, our tactical doctrine, our technological superiority. How can one primitive warrior be causing such destruction? "I believe, Commander, that we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human warfare," the intelligence officer replied carefully. "We assumed that their primitive technology indicated primitive tactics. We were wrong. The humans have developed combat doctrines that our computers never anticipated because they are, quite literally, thinking in ways that our strategic models cannot predict." "Explain." "They have abandoned conventional military doctrine entirely, sir. No unit cohesion, no territorial objectives, no supply lines to disrupt. Each human operative is essentially an independent weapon system capable of operating indefinitely without support. They use our technological advantages against us by forcing us to fight on their terms instead of ours." The truth of it was like a plasma bolt to the gut. The Krillians had prepared to fight a familiar enemy, an organized military with recognizable strategies. Instead, they faced something that had no precedent in galactic warfare, individuals who had made themselves into weapons of mass destruction. "What do you recommend?" The intelligence officer hesitated before answering. "Sir, I recommend we reconsider our assessment of human military capabilities, and I recommend we prepare for the possibility that this conflict may not proceed according to our original projections." But even as the Krillian leadership struggled to comprehend their enemy, Morrison was already planning his next operation. The aliens had made a critical error in their response patterns. Every time he struck a target, they concentrated their forces in that area, which left other areas temporarily undermanned. They were learning to fear him, but they still didn't understand him. And that lack of understanding was about to cost them something far more valuable than soldiers or equipment. It was about to cost them their sense of invincibility. Morrison had identified a target that would send a message the aliens couldn't ignore. Commander HFY himself. The alien leader had established his command center aboard the flagship Dominance, believing that orbit provided perfect security from ground-based threats. He was about to learn that nowhere was safe when the Ghost was hunting. The plan was audacious even by Morrison's standards. Infiltrate a Krillian supply facility, acquire alien technology, modify it to his specifications, and use their own equipment to reach a target they believed was untouchable. It would require precision, timing, and a level of improvisation that would challenge even his considerable abilities. But David Morrison had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. The aliens had declared war on humanity, and humanity was about to send them a message written in blood and delivered with interest. The ghost was going hunting, and this time, his target was the hunter who thought he was the apex predator. The war was about to reach orbit. The Krillian supply depot had been built inside what remained of Edwards Air Force Base, chosen for its existing infrastructure and isolated location. From orbit, it looked like a fortress: energy shields, automated defenses, and 3 full companies of elite warriors protecting the most advanced technology the Krillian Empire had to offer. David Morrison watched it through binoculars from a ridge 2 kilometers away, studying the patterns, timing the rotations, analyzing weaknesses that alien tactical computers insisted didn't exist. He had been observing for 72 hours, living on water and nutrient bars, moving position only when absolutely necessary. What he planned to do was impossible by every measure of military logic. A single human, armed with primitive weapons, against the most secure facility the aliens had established on Earth. The odds were astronomical, the risks incalculable, and the probable outcome was death. Morrison smiled and began checking his equipment one final time. The plan required 3 phases, each more audacious than the last. First, infiltrate the depot and acquire a Krillian atmospheric craft. Second, modify the craft to reach orbital altitudes without triggering the fleet's automated defenses. Third, get close enough to the flagship Dominance to take a shot that would end this war. It was a plan that relied on human innovation, alien overconfidence, and the kind of desperate creativity that emerged when survival depended on thinking beyond the boundaries of possibility. Phase 1 began at 0200 hours, when Morrison moved through the darkness like a shadow with deadly purpose. The aliens' night vision was excellent, but it operated on predictable spectrums. Morrison had modified his equipment with thermal dampeners, radar-absorbing materials, and optical camouflage that scattered their sensors like light through broken glass. He reached the perimeter fence without triggering a single alarm. The Krillians had made their first mistake in assuming that human technology was uniformly primitive. While their weapons lagged behind galactic standards, human special operations forces had developed infiltration techniques that were, in some ways, more sophisticated than anything the aliens possessed. Morrison's toolkit contained devices that could defeat energy barriers, bypass electronic locks, and neutralize automated sensors through methods that Krillian programmers had never anticipated. He was inside the compound within minutes. The second mistake the aliens had made was in the design of their facility. Krillian architecture followed mathematical principles that prioritized efficiency over security, creating blind spots and approach vectors that a trained infiltrator could exploit. Morrison moved through these gaps like water flowing downhill, always taking the path of least resistance, never challenging a position when patience would achieve the same result. His target was the vehicle maintenance bay, where atmospheric craft underwent routine service and repair. Intelligence suggested that at least one transport would be in the bay at any given time, and Morrison's technical knowledge indicated that Krillian propulsion systems could be modified with improvised components. He reached the bay without encountering a single guard. The craft waiting inside was more advanced than anything humanity had ever built, but Morrison had studied captured alien technology for weeks. The propulsion system operated on principles that human physicists were still struggling to understand, but the practical application was straightforward. Controlled manipulation of gravitational fields to achieve lift and thrust. Morrison had built his own gravitational manipulator using spare parts from destroyed Krillian equipment, human electronics, and engineering principles he had learned from watching how the aliens repaired their damaged systems. It was crude compared to their technology, dangerous beyond belief, and powerful enough to propel a small craft from Earth's surface to orbital altitudes. All he had to do was attach it to an alien transport without triggering any security systems, test fly it without being detected by orbital sensors, and use it to reach a target that every military expert in the galaxy would declare impossible to approach. Morrison got to work. The modification process took 6 hours. Morrison disconnected the craft's original propulsion system and replaced it with his improvised device, rerouted power systems to accommodate the increased energy demands, and installed a crude but effective stealth system based on principles he had observed in Krillian sensor technology. When he finished, the transport looked identical to its original configuration, but its capabilities had been transformed in ways that alien engineers would never anticipate. Morrison activated the craft's systems and lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, climbing steadily toward the invisible boundary between atmosphere and space. Below him, Earth turned slowly in the pale light of morning, scarred by bombardment but still beautiful, still home. Above him, the Krillian fleet waited in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming like stars against the black of space. The flagship Dominance hung at the center of the formation like a predator among its pack, 2 kilometers of crystalline armor and devastating weaponry. Morrison could see it through the craft's viewports, massive and seemingly untouchable, protected by energy shields that could deflect nuclear weapons and automated defenses that could track and eliminate incoming threats faster than human reflexes could follow. But Morrison wasn't relying on human reflexes. He was relying on human ingenuity. The stealth system he had installed operated on a principle that the Krillians had never encountered. Instead of trying to hide from their sensors, it convinced their computers that his craft was exactly what it appeared to be, a routine supply transport returning from the surface. The identification codes he had copied from the depot's computers identified him as Transport 77 Alpha, carrying standard cargo on a scheduled run. The automated defense systems scanned him, confirmed his identity, and ignored him completely. Morrison docked with the Dominance, like he belonged there. The cargo bay where he landed was nearly empty, occupied only by automated loading systems and a handful of maintenance technicians. Morrison waited until the bay had cycled through its atmospheric systems, then emerged from his craft with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. His stolen Krillian uniform was perfect down to the last detail. His forged identification would pass any casual inspection, and his understanding of alien social dynamics would allow him to move through the ship without attracting attention. But he wasn't planning to be on board long enough for anyone to look too closely. Commander Zexhi's command center was located in the ship's primary hull, protected by multiple layers of security and accessible only to the highest-ranking officers. Morrison reached it by following maintenance conduits that the ship's builders had never intended for infiltration, moving through spaces barely large enough for his human frame. When he emerged from the ventilation system into an auxiliary corridor 50 meters from his target, Morrison could hear the familiar sounds of a military command center, electronic chatter, status reports, the quiet efficiency of professional soldiers managing a complex operation. He could also hear something else: frustration. Losses continue to mount without corresponding tactical gains, one officer was reporting. The humans have demonstrated capabilities that exceed our projections by significant margins. Recommendations? Zexhi's voice was recognizable from the intercepted communications Morrison had studied. Sir, I believe we must consider the possibility that continued occupation may not be viable under current parameters. The cost in personnel and equipment is approaching unsustainable levels. Morrison smiled grimly as he prepared his equipment. The aliens were finally beginning to understand what they faced, but their understanding had come too late. He moved through the corridors with practiced stealth, avoiding patrols, bypassing security checkpoints, following the ship's blueprints that he had memorized during his approach. The command center's location was exactly where his intelligence had indicated, protected by barriers that were impressive by galactic standards, but had never been designed to stop someone who had spent 20 years learning how to kill from impossible distances. Morrison found his position in an observation gallery overlooking the command center. The location provided perfect sight lines, multiple egress routes, and enough concealment to remain undetected for the time he needed. Through the gallery's transparent aluminum windows, he could see Commander Zexhai standing at the central tactical display, his 4 arms gesturing as he studied the reports streaming in from the surface. The alien commander was exactly as Morrison had expected: professional, intelligent, competent within the parameters of his understanding. Unfortunately for Zexhai, those parameters were about to prove fatally inadequate. Morrison assembled his rifle with the mechanical precision of long practice. The weapon had been modified to function in the ship's atmospheric systems, chambered with rounds designed specifically to penetrate Krillian armor, and equipped with a scope that could compensate for the slight gravitational variations present in artificial environments. The range was only 60 meters, almost point-blank by Morrison's standards. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the easiest shot of his career. But nothing about this situation was normal. Morrison settled into firing position and began his breathing routine, allowing his heart rate to stabilize, his muscles to relax, his mind to achieve the perfect clarity that had made him legendary among human special forces. Through his scope, he could see Zexhai clearly, the alien commander's profile sharp against the tactical displays. One shot, one target, one chance to send a message that would reshape the entire character of this war. Morrison exhaled slowly and began applying pressure to the trigger. At that moment, an alarm began sounding throughout the ship, not the general alert Morrison had expected when his presence was detected, but something else. A priority communication from the surface. "Commander," one of the bridge officers called out. "Priority transmission from Colonel Thraknos. Emergency evacuation requested for all ground forces. Immediate withdrawal authorized by High Command." Zexhai's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Explanation." "Sir, the humans they've done something unprecedented. Our xenopsychology teams are calling it a cascade mobilization event. The individual we designated as the Ghost, his activities have somehow triggered a planet-wide resistance movement. Every major population center is reporting coordinated attacks on our positions." Morrison felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with his current mission. His war against the aliens had never been about personal glory. Every shot he had taken, every target he had eliminated, had been calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact. He had made the Krillians afraid, shown them that their technological superiority meant nothing against human determination. Now, that fear was spreading through their ranks like a virus, undermining their confidence, eroding their sense of invincibility. Other humans were taking up arms, following his example, proving that one person's courage could inspire an entire species to fight back. "How many humans are involved in these attacks?" Zexhai demanded. "Conservative estimate places active resistance fighters at over 50,000, Commander. But the number is growing exponentially. They're using the same tactics as the Ghost: invisible approach, precision strikes, immediate withdrawal. Our forces can't adapt fast enough to counter the threat." Morrison smiled as he watched the alien commander struggle with the implications. The Krillians had made their final mistake. They had assumed that humans would fight like every other species they had conquered. They had never considered that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their military organization. It was their refusal to accept defeat. Zexhai turned toward the tactical display, and Morrison had his shot. The alien commander's profile was perfect, the angle ideal, the distance negligible. One squeeze of the trigger would end the Krillian leadership and throw their occupation into chaos. Instead, Morrison lowered his rifle and activated the communication system he had installed in his equipment pack. "Commander Zexhai," he said, his voice carrying through the ship's internal communication network. "This is Sergeant Major David Morrison, United States Army. I believe you've been looking for me." The effect on the command center was immediate and dramatic. Alarms began sounding, security teams mobilized, and every weapon in the room turned toward the gallery where Morrison sat in plain view. "I could have killed you," Morrison continued calmly. "I've had you in my sights for the past 10 minutes, but I wanted to deliver a message personally." Zexhai's compound eyes fixed on the human who had caused so much destruction, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a new species. "Speak your message, human." "You came to Earth expecting to fight primitives. You thought our technology made us weak, our youth made us naive, our isolation made us defenseless. You were wrong about everything." Morrison stood slowly, his rifle held casually but ready. Through the command center's windows, he could see dozens of Krillian warriors moving to surround his position. But none of them seemed eager to be the first to engage the legendary ghost. "We're not primitive, Commander. We're focused. We don't have energy weapons because we perfected chemical propulsion. We don't have force fields because we learned to be invisible. We don't have starships because we never needed to run from a fight." "And this message required you to sacrifice your life?" Zexhai asked, his voice carrying what might have been curiosity. Morrison smiled, the expression clearly visible through his helmet's transparent visor. "Who said anything about sacrificing my life?" The explosive charges he had planted throughout the ship during his infiltration detonated simultaneously, crippling primary systems and sending the massive flagship spinning out of control. Emergency lighting bathed the command center in red, and the artificial gravity fluctuated wildly as the ship's power grid destabilized. In the chaos that followed, Morrison moved like a shadow given deadly purpose. His escape route had been planned with the same precision as his infiltration, taking advantage of the confusion to reach his concealed transport before the Krillians could organize an effective response. He was clear of the ship and beginning his descent toward Earth before the aliens even realized he was gone. Behind him, the flagship Dominance drifted powerless in space, its crew struggling to restore basic systems, while their commander stared at the empty gallery where an impossible human had delivered an unforgettable message. But Morrison's message was just beginning to be understood. Across Earth, the resistance movement that had started with one man's refusal to surrender was growing into something the aliens had never encountered. An entire species that had decided to fight rather than submit. Human snipers emerged from hiding places the Krillians had never suspected, turning every city into a battlefield, every building into a potential firing position. The technological superiority that had once guaranteed Krillian victory was becoming irrelevant in the face of human adaptability. Chemical weapons proved effective against energy shields. Primitive tactics succeeded where advanced doctrine failed. Individual determination overcame superior numbers. Commander Zexhai, his ship crippled and his occupation collapsing, finally understood what his species had attempted to conquer. They hadn't invaded a primitive civilization. They had challenged a species that turned every individual into a weapon, every citizen into a soldier, every defeat into motivation for victory. They had made war against humanity itself, and humanity, as the ghost had proven, did not surrender. 6 months later, the last Krillian transport left Earth's orbit, carrying the survivors of an invasion force that had learned the hardest lesson in the galaxy. Advanced technology was no substitute for the kind of courage that turned ordinary people into legends. David Morrison watched them go from a hillside outside what had been Washington, his rifle resting across his knees, his mission finally complete. The city below was rebuilding, rising from the ruins like a testament to human resilience. The war was over, but the legend of the ghost would endure. A reminder that sometimes the most primitive weapon was the most dangerous one of all, the human spirit that refused to be broken. The aliens had come expecting to crush primitive Earthlings. Instead, they had met humanity's Hitman and learned that some targets simply couldn't be conquered.